Chapter 1. The Arena Beneath the Stars. The air was thick with dust and the acrid tang of alien blood as Mira Solen stumbled into the vast arena of Calthar. Her knees buckled under her slight frame, the tattered remnants of her Concord uniform clinging to her skin, stained with grime and crimson streaks. At 12 years old, she was a prodigy of the Galactic Concord, a tactical genius who had outmaneuvered fleets twice her age, but here, in the hands of the Voryn, she was nothing more than prey. The guttural roars of the crowd echoed off the domed ceiling, a grotesque symphony of anticipation from 1,000 alien throats. Above, the artificial sky shimmered with hues of indigo and violet, as if the stars themselves had gathered to witness her end. Mira's vision blurred, her head throbbing from a wound she couldn't remember taking. Her left arm hung limp, useless, but she forced herself to stand, her pale gray eyes scanning the pit. The Voryn executioners loomed at the edge, their segmented armor glinting under the harsh lights. Their six-fingered hands gripped spears that hummed with electromagnetic charge, and their mandibles clicked in a rhythm that felt like mockery. The largest of them, a hulking figure with scales like molten obsidian, raised a clawed arm and bellowed something in their guttural tongue. Mira didn't understand the words, but the disdain in its tone was universal. She was a child, a weakling, a sacrifice. The crowd's roar grew louder as the ground trembled beneath her feet. In the center of the pit, a massive shape uncoiled, a creature so immense it seemed to defy the laws of physics. Zyrath, they called it, though Mira had only heard the name whispered in dread by her captors. Its scales gleamed silver white, catching the faint glow of the artificial sun overhead. A tail that could crush a starship curled lazily around its body. And when its amber eyes opened, they locked onto her with an intensity that stole her breath. Its nostrils flared, exhaling a wave of heat that rippled through the air, and the crowd erupted into chaos. Mira didn't move, she couldn't. Her body screamed for rest, her mind a haze of pain and exhaustion. This was supposed to be her end, a spectacle for the Voryn's twisted rituals. 6 months ago, she'd been part of a diplomatic mission to this uncharted sector, a chance to broker peace with the Voryn. She'd stood beside Commodore Torrin Drace, her sharp mind analyzing every move, every word, but the Voryn saw diplomacy as weakness. They'd ambushed the delegation, slaughtered half the officers, and dragged Mira through their capital streets as a trophy, the child strategist. They sneered, a prize for their arena. Now, here she was, alone and broken. The Voryn had beaten her, starved her, paraded her through their city until her legs gave out. Yet she hadn't cried, she hadn't begged, she'd stared ahead, her jaw set, refusing to give them the satisfaction. Even now, as Zyrath's gaze bore into her, she felt no fear, only a flicker of defiance she couldn't explain. The creature tilted its massive head, its golden horns catching the light. The crowd hushed, waiting for the inevitable, for fire to consume her, for claws to rend her apart. But Zyrath didn't strike. Instead, something brushed against her mind, not a sound, not a word, but a presence. It was sharp, ancient, and impossibly vast, like a galaxy folding into her skull. And then came the question, clear as if spoken aloud. 3 fortresses. 1 flaw. Which do you destroy? Mira blinked, her breath catching. A riddle? Her tactical training kicked in, her mind racing despite the fog of pain. She pictured the problem. 3 strongholds, each a pillar of defense, but one always hid a vulnerability. Her lips moved before she could stop them, her voice a hoarse whisper. The second, it conceals the power core. For a moment, silence. Then Zyrath's eyes narrowed, a glint of recognition, or approval, flashing within them. The crowd murmured, confused, their cheers faltering. The lead executioner barked an order, and 2 guards stepped forward, spears raised. But before they could reach her, Zyrath moved, its tail lashed out like a whip, a blur of silver that struck with the force of a collapsing star. The guards flew backward, their bodies slamming into the pit's walls with a sickening crunch. Dust exploded into the air, and the crowd's confusion turned to panic. Zyrath unfurled its wings, their translucent membranes shimmering like stained glass, and let out a roar that shook the arena to its foundations. It wasn't a sound of rage. Mira realized, it was defiance. She pushed herself up, her good hand clawing at the dirt. Through the haze, she saw Zyrath lower its head, its snout inches from her face. Those amber eyes studied her, not with hunger, but with curiosity. She felt its presence again, pressing against her thoughts, and a single impression formed. You are not like them. Mira's heart pounded. She didn't know what it meant, but she understood one thing. This creature wasn't her enemy. It was her chance, summoning the last of her strength. She staggered to her feet and reached out, her fingers brushing against Zyrath's scales. They were warm, alive, humming with an energy she couldn't name. If you're not going to kill me, she rasped, then help me fight. The dragon's response was immediate. With a beat of its colossal wings, it rose, and Mira grabbed a spine along its neck, hauling herself onto its back. The crowd screamed as Zyrath surged upward, its claws slashing at the energy pylons that powered the arena's containment field. Sparks rained down, and the artificial sky flickered, plunging the pit into chaos. Mira clung tight, her mind racing. She wasn't just a sacrifice anymore, she was a weapon. As Zyrath banked sharply, she spotted the control towers overlooking the arena, their glowing conduits exposed. There, she shouted, pointing with her good arm. Take them out. Zyrath didn't hesitate. It dove, its jaws opening to unleash a torrent of plasma that melted the towers into slag. The crowd scattered, their cheers turning to wails as the arena crumbled around them. Mira felt a thrill she hadn't known in months, not since the Voryn had torn her world apart. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't forgotten. She was alive. Above, Voryn warships stirred, their engines igniting in the fractured sky. Mira glanced up, her gray eyes narrowing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. She leaned forward, her voice steady despite the wind tearing at her. We're not done yet, she said to Zyrath. Let's show them what we can do. The dragon's wings beat harder, carrying them into the storm of fire and steel that awaited. Somewhere, deep within her, a memory flickered, a child's laugh. A game of starship tag abandoned for wargames and strategy boards. She pushed it aside. That girl was gone. The one riding Zyrath now had a purpose. To burn brighter than the stars watching above. To carve her name into the galaxy so no one would ever forget. Chapter 2. Bonds Under Fire. The sky above Calthar burned with streaks of plasma as Mira clung to Zyrath's spine, the wind tearing at her battered form. Below, the arena was a smoldering ruin, its once imposing walls reduced to rubble by their escape. Above, Voryn warships loomed like predators, their angular hulls bristling with cannons that spat blue fire into the night. Zyrath banked sharply, dodging a volley that sizzled past close enough to singe Mira's hair. Her heart hammered, but her mind was clear, sharper than it had been in months. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting. Left, she shouted, her voice nearly lost in the roar of Zyrath's wings. The dragon obeyed, twisting with an agility that defied its size. A second barrage missed them by inches, exploding into the clouds with a thunderous crack. Mira's good hand gripped tighter, her injured arm throbbing against her side. She scanned the enemy formation, 5 ships, staggered in a crescent pattern, their movements disciplined but predictable. She'd seen this before in simulations at the Concord Academy, back when her world was still equations and holograms instead of blood and dirt. Zyrath's presence brushed her mind again, sharper this time, like a blade cutting through fog. Their strength is their center. Break it? The question wasn't spoken, but it echoed in her skull, accompanied by a fleeting image, a Voryn warship, its core glowing with unstable energy. Mira nodded, her lips curling into a faint, determined smile. Yes, hit the flagship. It's the anchor. The dragon didn't hesitate. It folded its wings and dove, a silver comet streaking toward the largest ship. Mira pressed herself flat against its scales, feeling the heat of its body beneath her. As they closed in, Zyrath opened its jaws, unleashing a torrent of plasma that slammed into the flagship's shields. The barriers flared, hexagonal grids of light buckling under the force, then shattered. The blast tore through the hull, igniting a cascade of explosions that lit up the sky. The crowd's distant screams faded into the chaos as the ship listed, its engines dying in a plume of fire. Mira's chest tightened with a mix of triumph and dread. 1 down, but 4 remained. And they were already adjusting, tightening their formation, redirecting their fire. Zyrath climbed higher, weaving through the onslaught. But Mira felt something shift in its presence, a ripple of memory. Unbidden and raw, she saw a world of spires and crystal skies. A civilization of winged beings like Zyrath. Their voices a harmony of light. Then fire. Voryn ships raining destruction, reducing it all to ash. The vision ended as quickly as it came, leaving her breathless. What was that? She whispered, her voice trembling. Zyrath's response was slow, tinged with an emotion she couldn't name. Draconis, my home. They took it from me. Another image followed. Zyrath, younger, fiercer, leading a fleet of its kind against the Voryn, only to fall, captured, enslaved. I waited for one like you. Mira's throat tightened. A leader, a warrior, reduced to a spectacle in a pit. She understood waiting to prove herself, to escape the shadow of being the Concord's youngest officer. But this was different. This was centuries of loss, distilled into a single purpose. Before she could respond, Zyrath's voice cut through again. Urgent. They pursue. Your plan? She snapped back to the present, her gray eyes narrowing as she studied the remaining ships. They're clustering, protecting their flank. There's a gap on the right. Hit it, then loop back. Zyrath growled, a sound that vibrated through her bones, and veered right, its tail lashing out to deflect a stray bolt. They plunged into the gap, Mira shouting coordinates as Zyrath's claws raked across a smaller vessel. Metal screamed, and the ship spiraled downward, crashing into the jagged peaks below. Far above the fray, aboard the Nova Horizon, Commodore Torren Drace watched the battle unfold on the bridge's tactical display. His weathered face was a mask of gruff resolve, but his dark eyes betrayed a flicker of something softer, worry, perhaps, or pride. Around him, officers scrambled, their voices a chorus of updates and orders. Voryn fleet at 60% strength. One reported, unknown entity engaging. Sensors confirm it's the creature from the arena. Torren's jaw tightened. That's no creature, he muttered, staring at the grainy feed of Mira astride Zyrath. That's Mira Solen. He'd known her since she was 9. A scrawny kid with a mind like a steel trap, plucked from the academy to advise his fleet. He'd pushed her hard, too hard. Maybe, because he saw what she could become. But this? Riding a dragon into battle against an alien armada? Even he hadn't seen that coming. Sir, their flagship's down, another officer said, disbelief lacing his tone. She's winning. Not yet, Torren replied, his voice low. She's reckless. Always has been. He turned to the comms officer. Signal the fleet. Prepare for hyperspace jump. We're going in. But she needs to hold them off. Back in the sky, Mira felt the tide shifting. The Voryn ships hesitated, their formation faltering as Zyrath's fire carved through their ranks. But she knew it wouldn't last. Her body ached, her vision swimming from exhaustion and blood loss. She pressed a hand to her side, feeling the wet warmth of a wound she'd ignored too long. We can't take them all, she said, her voice cracking. Not like this. Zyrath's presence steadied her, firm and unyielding. You think as I do. Strategy over strength. What now? Another riddle followed, sharper this time. 5 hunters. 1 escapes. Where does it hide? Mira's mind raced, parsing the metaphor. The Voryn were the hunters. But she and Zyrath were the prey, and the escape wasn't retreat. It was misdirection. Their sensors, she said suddenly. Blind them. Hit their relay station, it's the small one at the rear. Zyrath roared in approval, banking toward the target. Its plasma breath struck true, vaporizing the relay in a burst of light. The remaining ships faltered, their coordination breaking as their scanners went dark. Mira grinned despite the pain. A spark of the old her, the girl who'd outsmarted admirals in wargames, flaring to life. Good, she murmured. Now we. A shadow loomed overhead, cutting her off. A massive Voryn dreadnought emerged from the clouds, its cannons charging with a dull hum that shook the air. Mira's stomach dropped. They'd been baited, drawn out while the real threat waited. Zyrath's wings faltered, its presence in her mind tinged with alarm. Too many, too strong. No, Mira said, gritting her teeth. We're not done. She scanned the dreadnought, her tactical mind whirring. There. A blind spot near its ventral thrusters. A gap in its firing arcs. Dive, she ordered. Get us under it. Zyrath hesitated, then obeyed. Plunging toward the behemoth, plasma bolts rained down, grazing its scales, but it held course. Mira's world narrowed to the roar of wind, the heat of Zyrath's body, and the certainty that this was her fight, hers and the dragon's. Bound by something neither could yet name. From the Nova horizon, Torrin watched the dive, his fists clenching. Hold on, kid, he whispered, just hold on. Chapter 3. Secrets of Zyrath. The wind howled as Zyrath spiraled downward, its wings cutting through the ash-laden air of Calthar's lower atmosphere. Mira clung to its spine, her breath shallow, her injured arm pressed tight against her side. The dreadnought loomed above, its shadow swallowing them as its cannons charged. But Zyrath was faster. With a twist of its massive body, it veered into a jagged canyon, the rocky walls closing in like the jaws of a trap. The Voryn ship's barrage faltered, unable to track them through the narrow pass. Mira's head spun, the adrenaline fading into a dull ache that pulsed through her body. She could feel the warmth of blood soaking through her torn uniform. But she forced her mind to focus. We need cover, she rasped, her voice barely audible over the rush of wind. Somewhere they can't follow. Zyrath's presence brushed her thoughts, steady and calm despite the chaos. I know a place. Hold fast. The dragon banked sharply, diving toward a cavern mouth carved into the canyon's base. Its claws scraped the stone as it landed, folding its wings with a sound like rustling silk. Mira slid off its back, her legs buckling as she hit the ground. She caught herself against a stalagmite, panting, her gray eyes scanning the dim interior. The cave was vast, its walls shimmering with veins of luminescent crystal that cast a faint blue glow. Strange carvings spiraled across the stone, glyphs and patterns that felt older than the Voryn. Older than anything Mira had ever seen. She traced one with her fingers, feeling a hum of energy beneath her touch. What is this place? She asked, her voice echoing. Zyrath settled beside her, its amber eyes glinting in the half-light. A remnant, a memory. Its voice in her mind was softer now, tinged with something like sorrow. Images flooded her thoughts, the spires of Draconis rising into a sky of endless stars. Its people, winged, radiant, dancing in currents of light. Then the Voryn came, their ships blackening the horizon, their weapons tearing through the crystal cities. Mira saw Zyrath leading a desperate stand, its fire painting the sky, only to watch its kin fall one by one. The vision ended with Zyrath in chains, its world reduced to ash. Mira's chest tightened. You were their leader, she said quietly, and they enslaved you. Not just me, Zyrath replied. They took our purpose, our legacy. It tilted its head, revealing a jagged scar along its neck where scales had been torn away. Draconis was part of something greater, a network of balance. The Keystones. We guarded one, until the Voryn stole it. Keystones? Mira frowned, her tactical mind latching onto the word. What are they? Zyrath's gaze shifted to the carvings. Machines of the makers, ancient beyond your reckoning. They hold the laws of the galaxy together, time, space, life itself. The Voryn thought they could wield them, but they only awoke what should have stayed dormant. A new image flickered, a crystalline sphere pulsing with energy, hidden deep beneath Calthar, and a shadow within it, cold, infinite, watching. Mira shivered, the implications sinking in. They're not just fighting us, she murmured. They're afraid of something worse. Before Zyrath could respond, a rumble shook the cavern. Dust rained from the ceiling, and Mira tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for a weapon she didn't have. Zyrath's wings flared, its body coiling protectively around her. They come. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall, scarred, clad in armor that gleamed like obsidian. Krezer, the Voryn warlord, stepped forward, his mandibles clicking in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Behind him, a squad of warriors fanned out, their spears humming with charge, his yellow eyes fixed on Mira. Then Zyrath, a flicker of recognition, or dread, passing through them. You should not be here, human, Krezer said, his voice a low growl in accented standard. This is sacred ground. Mira straightened, ignoring the pain lancing through her side. Sacred? she shot back. You turned it into a slaughterhouse. What's sacred about that? Krezer's mandibles twitched, a gesture that might have been anger or amusement. You understand nothing. Zyrath is no pet to be tamed. It is a tool, a key to order. We sacrifice to keep the chaos at bay. Chaos? Mira's eyes narrowed. You mean the thing in the Keystone? Krezer stiffened, his grip tightening on his spear. You've seen it, he said, more statement than question. Then you know why we cannot fail. Zyrath growled, its tail lashing the ground. They fear what they unleashed. The Harbinger. It waits below, and they think blood will appease it. Mira's mind raced. The Voryn weren't just conquerors, they were desperate, clinging to a ritual they didn't fully understand. She glanced at the carvings again, her fingers tracing a map-like pattern that spiraled downward. It's under the city, she said, piecing it together. The Keystone. That's where you're keeping it. Krezer took a step forward, his warriors raising their weapons. You will not reach it. Child, your kind meddles in forces beyond your grasp. Maybe, Mira said, her voice steady despite the odds. But I'm not the one who woke it up. She turned to Zyrath, her thoughts brushing against its mind. Can we get out? Yes, it replied, but not without cost. Its amber eyes met hers, and she felt a question unspoken. Are you ready to trust me? She didn't hesitate. Do it, Zyrath roared, its wings snapping open as it lunged forward. Its tail swept through the Voryn ranks, sending warriors crashing into the walls. Krezer dodged, barking orders as his squad fired, blue bolts crackling against Zyrath's scales. Mira ducked behind a stalagmite, her heart pounding as she scanned the cave. There, a tunnel at the far end, narrow but passable. Over there, she shouted, pointing. Zyrath pivoted, its claws raking the stone as it charged the tunnel. A spear grazed its flank, drawing a hiss of pain. But it didn't slow. Mira ran beside it, her legs burning, her vision blurring. The tunnel swallowed them just as Krezer's voice echoed behind. You cannot escape the inevitable. The passage twisted downward, the crystal glow fading into darkness. Mira stumbled, catching herself against Zyrath's side. They'll follow, she panted. We need a plan. Zyrath's presence steadied her, its voice firm. We go to the Keystone. It calls us both. Mira nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what lay ahead, only that she and Zyrath were bound now. Not just by survival, but by something deeper. The Voryn feared the Harbinger. But she feared something worse, being forgotten. A child lost to the galaxy's endless wars. Whatever the Keystone held, she'd face it, not as a sacrifice, but as a force they'd never see coming. Chapter 4. The battle aboard the Dreadspire. The tunnel spat them out into a storm of ash and fire. Mira stumbled as Zyrath surged upward, its wings beating against the turbulent air of Calthar's surface. Above, the Voryn dreadnought, the Dreadspire, loomed like a leviathan, its hull a jagged silhouette against the fractured sky. Its cannons glowed with a menacing hum. Tracking their ascent, Mira's breath caught, her mind racing despite the pain clawing at her side. They'd escaped Krezer's squad, but this was a different beast, one she couldn't outrun. We can't fight that out here, she said, her voice hoarse. It's too big. She scanned the ship, her tactical instincts kicking in. There, hangar bay, lower left. We get inside, hit them where they're vulnerable. Zyrath's presence pulsed in her mind, sharp and questioning. Inside? A cage within a cage? Its amber eyes flicked to her, skepticism radiating through their bond. Trust me, Mira replied, her jaw set. We can't win trading shots. We take the heart. The whole thing falls. The dragon growled, a low, resonant sound that vibrated through her bones, then dove toward the Dreadspire. Plasma bolts streaked past, close enough to sear the air, but Zyrath's agility outmatched the ship's targeting systems. It landed with a seismic crash in the hangar bay, its claws buckling the metal floor. Voryn soldiers scattered, their electromagnetic rifles spitting blue bolts that ricocheted harmlessly off Zyrath's scales. Its tail lashed out, sweeping through the ranks like a scythe, sending bodies and equipment tumbling. Mira slid off its back, wincing as her boots hit the deck. Her vision swam, blood loss and exhaustion gnawing at her edges. But she pushed it aside. She sprinted to a control panel, her fingers dancing over alien glyphs. "Come on," she muttered, deciphering the interface through sheer will. Zyrath loomed behind her, its massive frame a shield against the chaos. She felt its thoughts brush hers. They regroup. "Hurry," and nodded, her focus narrowing. The schematic flickered to life. A labyrinth of corridors leading to the ship's reactor core. "There," she said, pointing. "That's our target. If we overload it, this thing's done." She glanced at Zyrath. "Can you get us there?" "Yes," it replied, "but they will not yield easily." Its tail coiled, ready to strike as more soldiers poured into the hangar, elite Voryn commandos. Their movements precise, their eyes unnaturally blank. Mira froze. Something was wrong. These weren't the brutes from the arena. They moved like puppets, their mandibles slack, their rifles aimed with eerie synchronicity. "What's happening to them?" she whispered. Zyrath's growl deepened, its presence in her mind darkening. "The Harbinger. It stirs. It claims them." Before she could process the words, the commandos opened fire. Zyrath lunged, its claws tearing through their ranks. But for everyone it felled. Two more emerged. Mira ducked behind the panel as a bolt grazed her shoulder. The pain sharp and immediate. She gritted her teeth, forcing her hands back to the controls. "I've got a path," she said, her voice tight. "Maintenance shaft. 50 meters left. Go." Zyrath roared, its plasma breath incinerating a swath of commandos, and charged the shaft. Mira ran beside it, her legs screaming, her vision blurring. The tunnel was narrow, its walls slick with condensation. But Zyrath forced its way through, its scales scraping the metal. Behind them, the commandos pursued, their footsteps echoing like a relentless drumbeat. The shaft opened into a cavernous chamber, the reactor core. A pulsating sphere of energy hung at its center, suspended within a lattice of glowing conduits. The air crackled with static, making Mira's hair stand on end. She stumbled to a console, her fingers trembling as she worked. "This is it," she said, bypassing layers of encryption. "If we destabilize it." A cold presence slammed into her mind, cutting her off. It wasn't Zyrath's warmth, but something alien, vast, and utterly devoid of mercy. "You cannot stop what is infinite," it whispered, a voice that slithered through her thoughts like ice. She gasped, clutching her head as images flashed, stars dying, planets crumbling, a radiant figure of light towering over the wreckage. The Harbinger. Zyrath's roar shook the room, its wings flaring as it coiled around her. "Fight it!" Its voice thundered in her skull, pulling her back. She blinked, the vision fading, but the chill lingered. "It's awake," she croaked. "It's here." The chamber doors burst open, and the commandos flooded in, their blank eyes glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Zyrath charged, its claws slashing through conduits to block their advance. But they kept coming, driven by the Harbinger's will. Mira's hands flew across the console, her heart racing. She found the override command, a gamble that could either cripple the ship or destroy them all. "We need time," she said, glancing at Zyrath. "Can you hold them?" "For you, I will," it replied, its presence steady despite the odds. It launched itself at the enemy, a whirlwind of fire and fury, its scales glowing with each strike. Mira felt the heat of its breath behind her as she entered the final sequence. The reactor's alarms blared, a cacophony of warning signals that drowned out the battle. The first commando reached her, its rifle raised. She ducked, slamming her elbow into its gut, a weak blow, but enough to stagger it. Zyrath's tail swept it away, but more closed in. "Now or never," she muttered, hitting the execute command. The reactor pulsed, its energy building to a critical mass. Mira braced herself, but Zyrath's voice cut through her fear. "You will not die here." With a deafening roar, the dragon seized her in its claws and leapt toward the chamber's upper vents. The reactor erupted behind them, a blinding wave of light and heat that consumed the commandos and buckled the Dreadspire's core. Zyrath burst through the hull, its wings shielding Mira as debris rained around them. The ship shuddered, its structural integrity failing, then began to plummet toward Calthar's surface. Mira clung to Zyrath, her body trembling, her mind reeling. They'd done it, crippled the Voryn's flagship, but the Harbinger's presence lingered. A shadow at the edge of her thoughts. "It's not over," she whispered, her voice lost to the wind. Zyrath's amber eyes met hers. Its resolve unshaken. No, but we are stronger now. Far above, aboard the Nova Horizon, Commodore Torren Drace watched the Dreadspires fall, his fists unclenching. Status? He barked. Target neutralized. An officer replied. Mira and the creature. They're alive. Torren's lips twitched, a rare hint of a smile. Of course they are, he said. Signal the fleet. We're not done yet. Chapter 5. Journey to the Keystone. The Nova Horizon cut through hyperspace, its engines humming a steady rhythm that vibrated through the deck. Mira stood in the tactical briefing room, her bandaged arm resting in a sling, her gray eyes fixed on a holographic map of the ORITH-7 system. The Dreadspire's destruction had bought them time, scattering the Voryn fleet, but the victory felt hollow. The Harbinger's cold presence lingered in her mind, a shadow she couldn't shake. She rubbed her temple, the ache of its touch still raw. Zyrath's massive form was absent, too large for the ship's corridors, but its voice brushed her thoughts. Warm and steady, you are troubled. It was perched on the Nova Horizon's outer hull, its claws gripping the plating, its wings folded against the void. Mira glanced out the viewport, catching a glimpse of its silver scales glinting under the hyperspace glow. Troubled doesn't cover it, she muttered, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. That thing. It's not just a weapon. It's alive, and it's awake because of us. Not us, Zyrath corrected. The Voryn. They broke the seal long before you were born. We merely opened the door they feared to face. Mira's jaw tightened. She turned back to the map, her fingers tracing the orbit of ORITH-7's fifth moon. The intercepted Voryn data painted a cryptic picture. The Keystone wasn't just a prison for the Harbinger, it was a linchpin, stabilizing the fabric of space in this sector. If it failed, the consequences wouldn't stop at Calthar. Entire systems could collapse, stars imploding, planets torn apart. She'd seen the Harbinger's vision, a galaxy reduced to silence. The door slid open, and Commodore Torren Drace stepped in, his weathered face etched with fatigue. You look like hell, kid, he said, his gruff tone softened by a flicker of concern. Feel worse, Mira replied, managing a faint smirk. What's the word? Torren crossed his arms, nodding at the map. Fleets mopping up the Voryn stragglers. Calthar's in chaos, they're pulling back to their outer defenses. But we've got bigger problems. He tapped a console, pulling up a fragment of Voryn comms. The glyphs were unintelligible to Mira, but the translation scrolled beneath. The Keystone stirs. The Harbinger rises. Contain or perish. Contain or perish. Mira echoed, her stomach twisting. They're not fighting to win. They're fighting to survive. Torren's dark eyes met hers. And we're walking into the middle of it. ORITH-7's a graveyard, dead moons. Dying star. Sensors picked up a structure on the fifth moon. Subterranean. Massive. Not Voryn design. Older. The Keystone, Mira said, her voice steady despite the chill creeping up her spine. We need to get there. Now. Torren hesitated, his jaw working as if chewing on words he didn't want to say. You're not in any shape for this. Mira, the medics. Medics can't stop what's coming. She cut in, her tone sharp. You know I'm right. If that thing gets loose, it's not just the Voryn who'll perish. It's everyone. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. You've got a point, but you're not going alone. I'm sending a ground team, and that dragon of yours better behave. Mira's lips twitched. Zyrath's not mine. We're partners. Torren raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Get some rest. We drop out of hyperspace in 6 hours. She nodded, but rest was the last thing on her mind. As Torren left, she sank into a chair, her eyes drifting to the map. The fifth moon stared back, a scarred orb of ash and secrets. She'd spent her life proving herself, to the Academy, to Torren, to the galaxy, a child prodigy. They'd called her, but all she'd wanted was to be remembered, not as a footnote in someone else's war, but as someone who mattered. Now, facing the Keystone, that fear clawed at her again. What if this was it? What if she faded into nothing? Zyrath's voice broke her spiral. You fear oblivion. It wasn't a question. Mira leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Doesn't everyone? Not I, it replied. Draconis is gone, but I endure. You will too, in your way. She snorted softly. Easy for you to say. You're a legend. I'm just a kid with a knack for breaking things. Legends are made, not born, Zyrath said, its tone almost gentle. You broke their chains. You broke their ship. Break their fear, and the galaxy will know your name. Mira didn't respond, but the words settled into her. A spark against the dark. She closed her eyes, letting the hum of the ship lull her into a fitful doze. Hours later, the Nova Horizon emerged from hyperspace into the desolate expanse of Orith-7. Mira stood on the bridge, watching as the system unfolded, a dying star casting a faint orange glow over a graveyard of shattered moons. The fifth moon hung in orbit around a gas giant, its surface a wasteland of ash and jagged rock. Charming place, she muttered. Rano signatures detected, the tactical officer reported. 3 ships in low orbit. They're guarding something. Torren nodded, his voice clipped. Battle stations. Prepare for engagement. Mira's gaze lingered on the display. The Voryn ships weren't in a defensive spread, they clustered around a single point. Like sentinels. What's on that moon? She asked, her voice cutting through the tension. The science officer glanced at her console. Subterranean structure. Artificial. Massive energy readings. It's not Voryn tech. Predates them by millennia. That's it, Mira said, a chill running down her spine. The Keystone. The battle was swift and brutal. The Nova Horizon outgunned the Voryn ships, its cannons tearing through their shields. One vessel broke formation, diving toward the moon's surface in a desperate bid to protect its charge. They're going to ground, Torren observed, his tone grim. They don't want us near it. Then we go after them, Mira said, her eyes blazing. If they destroy it before we get there, we're done. Torren hesitated, then nodded. Prep a dropship. Carter, you're not. Try and stop me, she interrupted, already moving. She felt Zyrath's approval ripple through her mind as she headed for the hangar. The descent was rough, the dropship shuddering as it punched through the moon's thin atmosphere. Mira sat strapped in, her good hand gripping the harness. Her team, a squad of Concord Marines, silent around her. Zyrath followed outside, a silver shadow against the ash-gray sky. They landed near the crashed Voryn ship, its twisted hull still smoldering. Ahead, a vast circular doorway loomed, carved into the rock, its surface pulsing with eerie blue glyphs. The Marines hesitated, weapons drawn, but Mira stepped forward, drawn by a pull she couldn't explain. The glyphs flared brighter as she approached, the doorway grinding open with a sound like distant thunder. Beyond, darkness beckoned, thick with the hum of ancient power. Zyrath landed beside her, its presence a steady anchor. It calls us, it said. Are you ready? Mira took a breath, her fear of being forgotten warring with the fire in her chest. Yeah, she said, stepping into the unknown. Let's finish this. Chapter 6. Confronting the Harbinger. The air inside the Keystone structure was heavy, charged with an energy that prickled Mira's skin as she stepped through the doorway. The chamber stretched endlessly before her, its walls smooth and seamless, pulsing faintly with a light that seemed alive. At its center stood a pedestal, atop which rested a crystalline sphere, fractured but shimmering with an inner glow. The Concord Marines fanned out behind her, their rifles raised, but Mira's focus was on the sphere. It called to her, a pull she couldn't resist. Zyrath landed beside her, its claws clicking against the floor, its amber eyes narrowing. It is here, its voice rumbled in her mind. The Harbinger stirs. Before she could respond, a squad of Voryn warriors emerged from the shadows, their spears humming with charge. At their head stood Krezer, his scarred armor glinting in the eerie light, his yellow eyes locked onto Mira. Then Zyrath, his mandibles clicking in a slow, measured rhythm. You should not have come. Human, he growled. This is beyond you. Mira stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. Beyond me? You woke this thing. I'm here to fix your mess. Krezer's gaze flickered, a hint of unease breaking his stoic facade. Fix it? He said, his tone bitter. The Harbinger cannot be fixed. It can only be contained. And we have paid in blood to keep it so. Then why's it awake? Mira shot back, gesturing to the sphere. Your rituals failed. Before Krezer could answer, the chamber trembled, the crystalline sphere flared, its cracks widening, and a low hum filled the air. Mira staggered as a presence slammed into her mind, cold, alien, and overwhelming. It wasn't Zyrath's warmth, but the same icy touch she'd felt aboard the Dreadspire. "I am the Harbinger," it intoned, its voice a cascade of thoughts that pressed against her skull. "You have freed me." The sphere shattered, and light engulfed the chamber. When it faded, a figure stood where the pedestal had been, tall, radiant, its form shifting like liquid starlight. The Harbinger's presence was a weight, distorting the air around it. Mira's knees buckled, but Zyrath's growl steadied her, its wings flaring protectively. "What do you want?" she forced out, her voice trembling but defiant. The Harbinger turned its gaze, or its attention, toward her. Images flooded her mind, galaxies reduced to dust, civilizations erased, a void where life had once thrived. "I was bound to prevent my purpose," it said. "Now I will fulfill it. Your kind, their kind, all will end." Mira's breath caught. This wasn't a battle, it was extinction. She glanced at Krezer, who had dropped to one knee, his spear clattering to the floor. "You knew," she said, her voice rising. "You knew what it could do. We sought to hold it." Krezer rasped, his eyes fixed on the Harbinger. "The Keystone demands a price, a mind to anchor it. We offered what we could, but it was never enough." "Then how do we stop it?" Mira demanded, turning to the sphere's shards scattered across the floor. Krezer's mandibles clicked, a sound of frustration, or fear. "The sphere must be restored. It needs a consciousness, willing and strong, to bind the Harbinger again." Mira froze, the weight of his words sinking in. "A willing mind." She looked at Zyrath, its amber eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "It was me, once," it said, its voice soft. "I held it for centuries, until the Voryn broke me free. Now it seeks another." The Harbinger's light pulsed, growing brighter as it began to solidify. The chamber shook, cracks splintering across the walls. "You said you wanted to contain it." Mira shouted at Krezer. "Help me." Krezer hesitated, then barked an order. His warriors lowered their spears. Stepping back, "Cover her," he said to the Marines, his voice grim. "This ends now." The Harbinger shifted, its attention turning to the soldiers. With a wave of its hand, an unseen force slammed into them, sending bodies flying. Mira ducked as a Marine crashed beside her, his eyes glowing with the same blank light she'd seen on the Dreadspire. "It's controlling them," she yelled, scrambling to the shards. Zyrath roared, its claws slashing at the possessed Marines. But they kept coming, relentless. Mira's hands shook as she gathered the fragments, piecing them together. The shards hummed, their energy unstable, but they fit, imperfectly. Desperately, she placed her palms on the reassembled sphere, feeling its power surge through her. The Harbinger loomed closer, its voice a snarl in her mind. "You cannot contain me. I am infinite." "Shut up," Mira muttered, closing her eyes. She focused on the sphere, its systems awakening, searching for an anchor. Krezer's words echoed, "A willing mind." She thought of Zyrath shielding her from the Dreadspire's explosion, of its centuries of waiting. It had chosen this burden once. Now it was her turn. The Marines closed in, their rifles aimed at her head. Zyrath's tail swept them back, but its movements slowed, blood dripping from a gash in its flank. "Mira," it urged, "you must choose." "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking. She saw flashes of her life, the Academy's cold halls, her parents' proud smiles, the games she'd traded for war. Then Zyrath's golden eyes, steady and trusting. She wasn't strong enough, not like it had been. But strength wasn't the point. Willingness was. The Harbinger's light dimmed, its form wavering as the sphere's energy surged. "You will fail," it hissed, a note of fear creeping in. "Not today," Mira said, meeting its gaze. She pressed her hands harder against the sphere, letting its power pull her in. Her thoughts, her memories, herself, it all slipped away. Drawn into the crystal, she clung to them, a desperate child's instinct, but let go as Zyrath's presence enveloped her. Warm and certain, the chamber erupted in light, the Harbinger's scream echoing as it was dragged back into the sphere. The walls steadied, the air clearing, and silence fell. The sphere pulsed once, then stilled, whole again. Krezer stood, staring at it with awe and relief. The surviving Marines picked themselves up, their eyes clear, the Harbinger's hold broken. Torrhen's voice crackled over the comms. "Urgent, Carter. Report. What's happening down there?" Krezer picked up Mira's discarded comm unit. His voice heavy. "The human is gone. She bound the Keystone." A long pause. Then Torrhen's reply, thick with emotion. "Understood. Bring the team back." Zyrath lowered its head, its wings drooping. Blood stained the floor where Mira had stood. But she was nowhere. Only the sphere remained. A quiet sentinel. Krezer met the dragon's gaze. A silent acknowledgement passing between them. "She was more than we deserved," he said, turning away. The team retreated, leaving the chamber to its stillness. Inside the sphere, Mira felt herself slipping, her consciousness fading into an endless void. She'd saved them, the galaxy, the Voryn, the Concord, but at what cost? Her last thought was of Zyrath, its warmth a fleeting comfort as darkness claimed her. Chapter 7. The New Guardian. Mira awoke to silence, not the cold, empty void she'd expected, but a stillness alive with possibility. Her body was gone, her pain a distant memory. Yet she felt present. Around her stretched an infinite expanse, a crystalline void where light danced in patterns too vast to comprehend. Stars shimmered in the distance, their glow filtered through the Keystone's translucent walls. She wasn't dead, not in any way she understood. She was something else. The sphere pulsed faintly at her center, or perhaps she was its center. Her consciousness woven into its essence. She reached out, not with hands but with thought, and felt the Keystone respond. It was alive, a machine of unimaginable complexity, its purpose humming through her like a heartbeat. She saw the galaxy as if through a lens, planets spinning in quiet orbits, suns blazing with life, countless beings unaware of the fragile balance holding them together. "You did well." The voice broke the silence. Warm and familiar. Mira turned, or imagined turning, and there was Zyrath. Its form was smaller now, translucent, its silver scales shimmering like a ghost. Its amber eyes glowed with the same intelligence she'd come to trust. But there was a softness there, a peace she hadn't seen before. "I thought I was alone," she said, her voice steady despite the enormity of it all. "You are never alone here," Zyrath replied, its presence brushing hers like a breeze. "The Keystone is not a prison. It is balance. It is life sustained. And you are its heart." Mira let the words sink in, her mind expanding to grasp them. She'd expected oblivion, a sacrifice that erased her. Instead, she was part of something greater. "This isn't what I thought," she admitted. "I thought I'd be trapped. Like you were." Zyrath tilted its head, its wings rippling faintly. "I was not trapped. I chose this, as you did." The Makers built the Keystones to guard against chaos, entities like the Harbinger, forces that unravel existence. Draconis was one of many who served them, until the Voryn broke our watch. "So I'm, what, a jailer?" Mira asked, a flicker of her old defiance surfacing. "No," Zyrath said, its voice firm. "A guardian. The Harbinger is bound, but others may rise. The network endures because of us, because of you." Now, Mira's perception shifted, the Keystone's reach unfolding before her. She felt it, a web of unseen threads stretching across the galaxy. Each Keystone a node in a vast system. Some pulsed with life, others lay dormant, their guardians lost to time. She saw Orith-7's moon, the chamber where she'd stood, and beyond it, the faint hum of distant worlds. "There's more than one," she murmured, off-threading her voice. "How many?" "Countless," Zyrath replied. "The Makers foresaw threats beyond imagining. You hold this one, as I did, but your bond with me, it changed the Keystone. It changed you." "Changed me?" Mira echoed, her thoughts brushing the sphere's core. She felt the Harbinger there, a shadow locked in stillness, its malice silenced, but there was something else, a warmth, a spark that wasn't hers alone. "You're still here," she realized, part of it. Zyrath's form shimmered, its presence softening. "A gift, perhaps, or a choice. I waited centuries for you, Mira Solen, not just to fight, but to pass this to one who could bear it. Your will, your fire, it is enough." Mira thought of the arena, the Dreadspire, the moment she'd chosen to bind the Harbinger. She'd feared being forgotten, a child lost to the galaxy's endless wars. But here, she was eternal, not a name carved in stone, but a force woven into the stars. I didn't want to disappear, she said quietly. I wanted them to remember. They will, Zyrath assured her, not as a story, but as the peace they live. You gave them that. She let the truth settle, a weight lifting from her chest. The academy, the Voryn, the battles, they were fragments of a life she'd left behind. This was her purpose now, not forced upon her, but chosen. She felt the galaxy's pulse, fragile and resilient, and for the first time, she knew peace. Zyrath's form began to fade. Its task complete. This place is yours now, it said. Guard it well. Your bond was my final gift. You gave me purpose when I had none. Don't go, Mira said, a pang of loss cutting through her calm. I don't know how to do this alone. You won't, Zyrath replied, its voice a whisper as it dissolved. I am with you, always. Its warmth lingered, a faint echo at the edge of her mind. And then it was gone. Mira stood, or existed, within the void, the Keystone's light wrapping around her. She reached out again, feeling the network's expanse, and understood. She wasn't its prisoner. She was its steward, its guide. The Harbinger was bound, but the galaxy was vast, and other shadows might stir. She'd be ready, not as a child prodigy or a soldier, but as something new. Outside, on the moon's surface, the Keystone grew silent. The Voryn retreated, their ships vanishing into the dark. Krezer stood at the chamber's edge, his warriors behind him, staring at the sealed doorway. It is done, he said, his voice low. The human has spared us all. He turned away, leaving the structure untouched, a reverence settling into his scarred frame. Aboard the Nova Horizon, Commodore Torren Drace watched the team return, his jaw tight. The Marines reported Mira's loss, their voices heavy with grief. Torren stared at the moon on the viewscreen, its ash-gray surface unchanged. She always had a plan, he muttered, rubbing his temples. God help her, wherever she is. The ship jumped to hyperspace, carrying the survivors back to Concord space. Mira's name would spread, Lieutenant Solen, the child who'd turned the tide, but Torren knew the truth was bigger than any legend. She'd given them a future, and he'd carry that weight for her. Within the Keystone, Mira smiled, a small, fleeting thing, born of acceptance. She felt Zyrath's echo, a companion in the endless watch, and turned her gaze to the stars. There were no more battles to fight, no more fears to conquer. She was the guardian now, her fire eternal, burning quietly for a galaxy that would never know her name. Chapter 8. Legacy Beneath the Stars. Years had passed since the battle at Orith-7, and the galaxy had shifted in subtle, quiet ways. The Voryn, once a scourge of conquest, withdrew to their home systems, their fleets silent, their cities cloaked in an uneasy peace. On Calthar, where Mira Solen had first faced the arena, the pit lay abandoned, its walls crumbling into dust. The Voryn no longer spoke of sacrifice with pride. Instead, they told a new story, a tale whispered in their halls, passed down through generations. The human who'd burned brighter than their fire, who'd bound the Harbinger and spared them all. They called her the Eternal Flame, a warning and a hope etched into their scarred culture. In Concord space, Mira's name became legend, though the details blurred with time. The Nova Horizon returned to its docks, its crew carrying the weight of her loss. Commodore Torren Drace stood before the Galactic Concord's council, his voice steady as he recounted her actions, how 12-year-old Prodigy had turned the tide against the Voryn, how she'd given herself to the Keystone to save them all. Medals were struck, her name inscribed in the archives. But Torren refused the pomp. She didn't do it for statues, he'd said, his gruff tone hiding a grief he'd never voice. She did it because it was right. The galaxy moved on, as galaxies do. Wars faded into skirmishes, alliances formed and fractured, and the Keystone on Orith-7's fifth moon stood silent, its glyphs dim, its purpose hidden from those who passed by. The Voryn left it untouched, their reverence outweighing their old ambitions. The Concord marked it as a restricted zone, a monument to a victory no one fully understood. Life continued, fragile, resilient, unaware of the quiet sentinel watching over it. But within the Keystone, Mira Solen endured. The crystalline void was her home now. A boundless expanse where time held no meaning. She felt the galaxy's pulse, stars birthing and dying, planets spinning through their cycles, beings living lives she'd never know. The Harbinger remained bound, a shadow locked in the sphere's depths, its malice a distant echo she could ignore. She was no longer the child who'd feared oblivion, nor the soldier who'd fought to prove herself. She was something more, a guardian woven into the fabric of existence. Her fire a steady glow in the dark. At first, she'd explored the Keystone's reach, her consciousness stretching along its network. She sensed other nodes, some alive with guardians like her, others cold and empty, their stewards lost to eons. She couldn't touch them, not yet, but their presence comforted her. She wasn't alone in this vast watch. Zyrath's echo lingered too, a warmth at the edge of her mind, a companion in the silence. "You're still here," she'd said once, and felt its quiet affirmation. Always. As years turned to decades, Mira discovered something new. The Keystone wasn't just a prison or a shield, it was a conduit. She could send fragments of herself outward, not as words or commands, but as dreams. She tested it cautiously, weaving visions of courage and hope into the minds of those who needed them most, warriors facing impossible odds, children dreaming of stars, leaders faltering under the weight of choice. She saw a pilot dodge a fatal shot, a poet write of a flame that never faded, a Voryn child refuse to raise a spear. Small ripples, but they spread, a legacy she hadn't expected. One day, or what passed for a day in her timeless state, she felt a pull. A signal from beyond the Keystone's walls. She focused, her perception sharpening, and saw the Nova horizon. Older now, its hull patched and weathered. It orbited Orith-7. Its sensors trained on the moon. Torrin stood on the bridge, his hair fully gray, his face lined with years of command. He stared at the viewscreen, his dark eyes distant. "Anything?" he asked, his voice rougher than she remembered. A young officer shook her head. "No response, sir. Just a faint energy spike, same as last time." Torrin nodded, his lips twitching into a faint smile. "She's still out there," he murmured. Never was one to give up. Mira felt a pang, not sorrow, but something close to it. She reached out, threading a dream into his mind. A girl on a dragon's back. Fire in her eyes, a galaxy safe beneath her watch. Torrin's shoulders relaxed, a weightlifting he hadn't known he carried. "Keep scanning," he ordered, but his tone was lighter. "She'll let us know when she's ready." The ship lingered a moment longer, then jumped to hyperspace, leaving the moon in silence. Mira smiled, a flicker of her old self shining through. Torrin hadn't forgotten her, not as a name, but as a promise. She turned her gaze back to the stars, feeling the Keystone's network hum with life. There were threats out there, shadows stirring in the dark, and she'd be ready when they came. But for now, there was peace. She thought of Zyrath, of the arena where they'd forged their bond, of the battles that had led her here. She'd wanted to be remembered, to burn so bright no one could ignore her. Now she understood. Her light wasn't in monuments or tales, but in the lives she guarded, the futures she shaped. The galaxy turned, oblivious to her watch, and that was enough. Then, a flicker, a signal from another Keystone. Faint but insistent. Mira's focus sharpened, her fire stirring. It wasn't a threat, not yet, but a call. She felt Zyrath's echo flare, a spark of curiosity matching her own. "Something's waking up," she said, her voice a whisper in the void. "Guess we're not done after all." Outside, the moon's surface remained still, its secrets buried deep, but within, Mira Solen, the eternal flame, stood among the stars. Her watch unbroken, her purpose renewed. She was no longer just a guardian. She was a beacon, a guide, and perhaps, one day, a force that would step beyond the Keystone's walls. For now, she waited, her smile lingering as the galaxy spun on. Safe beneath her light,